Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Sarfati. I am the Vice President of Community Engagement at NORD. In working with this special community, I see firsthand the toll that it can take on patients, caregivers, and their families constantly living in a world full of uncertainties. In our next session, our panelists will share their experiences living in that world and navigating all of the unknowns. Joining us for this session is Dr. Al Freedman, psychologist at Freedman Counseling Associates and bereaved rare caregiver, who will be moderating this session. And he will be joined on stage by Colonel Stephen Coffey, Director, Military Personnel with the National Security Agency and a rare caregiver, Dr. Maggie Kang, advocate, physician, life coach, and rare caregiver, and Joanne Sperando, patient advocate and person living with a rare disease. I want to thank our speakers for being here with us today, and I will now turn it over to you, Dr. Freedman.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Good morning. My name is Al Freedman. I'm going to introduce myself, and then our panelists will introduce themselves, and then I'll introduce our topic, and we'll begin our conversation about living with uncertainty. I'm Al Freedman. I live in Westchester, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. I'm here first because I'm a dad. I had two children, Jack and Kara. And my son, Jack, was diagnosed at the age of 6 months with, at the time, an untreatable condition called spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA. And at the age of 6 months, Jack was given 1 year to live. And we were lucky because Jack lived for 26 years. He passed October 2021 and was very lucky to be his dad for so many years. My daughter Kara, who's riding on the back of that wheelchair, is now all grown up and 23 years old. And proud to say she's actually has her first job out of college as a full-time employee here at NORD in the research department. I'm very proud of her. After growing up with a brother like Jack and all the challenges that came from being her brother, I thought she'd run as far away from rare disease as she could, but she's taken a step towards it by being part of NORD, and I'm very proud of her for that. And I am professionally a psychologist. I'm a practicing psychologist, and a good portion of my practice at this point is rare disease. About half or more than half of the patients in my practice are affected by rare disease around the country. My license, because of COVID, is good in about 38 states. So I'm supporting many families like yours and mine each and every day, and I greatly respect the challenges that you all face and that we all face together. So it's an honor for me to be here, and I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panel of colleagues here who also are impacted by rare disease every day. Dr. Kang and Colonel Coffey and Joanne, I'd love for you to each introduce yourselves.
I'm sorry, I'm first, Al? We're going this way, okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Joanne Sperando. I am from Long Island, New York. There should be pictures, but maybe not. Oh, there we go. That picture of those three beautiful women, this is how I tell my story. I have an illness called pulmonary arterial hypertension, and it is genetic in my family. In 1963, but that picture was taken in 58. That's my beautiful mother in the middle. She's now 86 years old. On the left is my Aunt Josie. She died at 23 years old, newly married, wanted to start a family, got pregnant, and passed away within her first trimester. Pulmonary hypertension and pregnancy really don't do very well together. My mom remembered that something happened with Aunt Josie's pulmonary artery, but the years went on and it just didn't stick with her until the next picture. That's my brother and myself. On the left, My brother was 34, and he started passing out, and we knew something was wrong. And he went on this journey, as we all have, probably 2 years trying to figure out exactly what was wrong with him. We pulled Aunt Josie's records after a while and saw pulmonary artery and pulmonary hypertension. So we realized that we had some very vicious genetics at work. You may recognize that pretty girl right next to me. That is NORD's Debbie Castro, when she worked for the Pulmonary Hypertension Association. We have been friends since that time, and my sister-in-law, Shelley. The good news for me is that very recently I was just told that we've identified the genetic mutation that causes our brand of pulmonary hypertension. So that was a very big thing for us. So I'm going to move on. Thank you so much.
So good morning. I'm Colonel Stephen Coffey. And if I could quote one of my favorite authors, Charles Dickens, when he said that it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. Those words never rang more true than with the birth of my son, Stephen Coffey II. And he actually is here today. He wanted to come in for the session, so thank you for the support, son. So Stephen was born on September 28, 2012. And I was so excited because I knew that I would have a son to carry on the good name. When he was born, the nurses took him away, and I thought everything was normal because he actually was born at 36 and a half weeks, so almost full term. But they took him away, and they said he had this high bilirubin, and low glucose, and he was a little bit jaundiced. I didn't quite understand what that was, but they assured me that he would be okay. What I found out later is that Stephen had a very rare metabolic condition called galactosemia. And the condition is whereby his body cannot break down the simple sugar, galactose, that's found in human and animal milk. And so my wife's mother's milk was damaging his liver unbeknownst to him and certainly unbeknownst to us. On November 28th, we were rushed into a hospital and we were told that Stephen has fulminant liver failure secondary to galactosemia. And 5 days later, he was the youngest person in the country in 2012 to have a liver transplant. So thank you, son, for being here with me today. But when I think about the connection of the anxiety that we felt as parents and the anticipation that we had for him, for parents, and for his life, those things changed. So I look forward to a very fruitful discussion with you all this morning. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie Kang. I'm a mom caregiver to my daughter, Nell, who was diagnosed at age 9 with neuromyelitis optica. It's a rare autoimmune disease that affects or can affect the optic nerve, the brain, and the spinal cord. And she's actually here with me today, too, sitting right here. And she's nearly 15. In addition to being a caregiver, I'm also a physician. And after the ordeal, I actually became a life coach supporting moms with kids of chronic needs. And in addition to that, Nell and I have both become rare disease advocates. And I was moved to share my story on the TEDx stage last November. The title of my talk is called "The Truth About Pain and Suffering Will Change Your Life." And I'll share a little bit more about that in this conversation, but it was essentially the story of when Nell was diagnosed and just the horror and a lot of guilt and sort of mental struggle that I endured, but learned quite a bit from. So I look forward to sharing that with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We're all very privileged to have all three of our panelists here today to talk about the topic. I opened up the program to read our topic, living with uncertainty. And the first sentence of the description says it all. The journey through life with a rare disease is filled with uncertainty. Now, the reality is we know that every life has some uncertainty. As a psychologist, I can tell you that everybody lives with a certain amount of uncertainty. but we who are affected by rare disease are challenged by uncertainty at a different level. And that challenge is complicated for us, obviously. And the topic of mental health has been, COVID shined a light on the topic of mental health for the whole world. And we who've been affected by rare disease, we know what living with uncertainty means. We did well before COVID and well before everybody else was living with uncertainty. We all are at different stages of our journey with rare disease. And when we start out with a lot of fear. And my goal for our panel today is to help all of us in the room to view the topic of uncertainty by moving from a place of fear to a place of hope, from a place of fear to a place of love. When we begin our journey in rare disease, it often begins with a diagnosis, a day of diagnosis or a diagnostic journey. That it did for me as a dad. And that day or that period of time when our lives move from what the life we expected to have to the life that's filled with uncertainty because of rare disease is a day that I will never forget. And it's often filled with trauma, and it's filled with symptoms, and it's filled with unusual challenges. And so I'd like to begin our conversation today at the beginning of our journeys by talking about the day your life changed. What will we never forget about the day our life changed and the feelings we've had when our life changed? And the beginning of our journey, how did it feel? What was it like that launch into what I call the twilight zone? Whether it was a sudden launch or a long launch. Let's talk about that first. Who'd like to begin?
I'll start. Is that okay? So, as I was saying, my daughter Nell was diagnosed at age 9, and prior to that, she was robustly healthy, playing on a travel lacrosse team, and she had never missed a day of school. So when she suddenly developed these nonspecific symptoms of nausea, feeling like she had to vomit, and some mild dizziness, I thought it was unusual. And when it progressed to a point where I was not comfortable with her being at home, I took her to the emergency room, but I wasn't thinking that it was going to be anything, because up until that point, everyone was like, oh, she probably just has some nonspecific virus. So we got there, and there was a neurologist that was consulted who ordered a brain MRI. I went with her to the scanner because I'm a physician. And when her images came over from the scanner onto that computer screen, that was the moment that my life changed. I was not expecting what I saw, which were multiple abnormal areas of signal in her brain, her deep brain, and the brainstem. I was really, I think it's like really indescribable, and probably shock is not really going to tell you the degree to which I had experienced that emotion. And I could barely stand as those images came through. I knew Nell was coming out of the scanner, but she was still under sedation. So I sat there just sort of pouring through those images, wondering in my mind how this could have happened. And I went straight to, I should have picked this up. I was blaming myself as if like I was her mother and a physician. Why didn't I do something sooner? Why didn't I image her sooner? Everything was going through my head as if like I should have done something to prevent this. When Nell was starting to wake up from her sedation, I knew I had to pull myself together and sort of steel my nerves and go to her and tell her in like the calmest manner I could that there were some findings, it's going to be okay, and that we're going to be admitted. And so I couldn't even touch her hand because I was shaking. So I remember gripping the steel bars of that gurney. And as we moved her out of the scanner to get her back into the ER, I just remember walking down that hallway. It was like 1 a.m. at night, and it was like kind of greenish. And I just thought I had entered a world that I did not understand. I was scared, lost, and feeling very guilty.
You know, one of the things I'd mentioned earlier in the introduction, that on November 28th, 2012, were sitting in this hospital in the ICU in the PICU. Now, I didn't even know that the PICU is where we send our sickest children. Did not know that. Because I had these ideas of what my son's life would be when he was born. And so when the resident presented Stephen and said that he has fulminant liver failure secondary to galactosemia and that he would eventually require a transplant, my world changed. That was an inflection point that my world changed. And it didn't just change because of the medical diagnosis. There was a personal change that happened with me. I had these hopes, these dreams, these ideas of what perfect Stephen looks like. And then there was the reality. There was a family dynamic that changed because I would go from being just a mere dad, which is awesome in itself, to now being a dad who is also a caregiver. And then the other thing was that I jumped into this new world, this new nomenclature of medicine. I can now talk to doctors and providers and tell them about jejunostomies, and I understand my son's liver enzymes, his ALTs and GGTs and ASTs, and what they mean and when those things go up and down and what that effect has for him. So those are things that I never understood would be byproducts of this diagnostic process. And so it's important to understand that as you go forward, to know that what you thought may have been was a thought. But what is reality, and that we have to be adaptable and flexible to live in the reality that we have. It's sort of like they say, play the cards you're dealt and enjoy them and win with the cards that you're dealt.
Bloom where you're planted,
Planet.
right?
Absolutely.
Steve, the Twilight Zone is the exact perfect definition of that. Your life changes from this to this in a second. I knew in 1 second that I could not have children because I had studied, when my brother John was diagnosed, I studied everything about the illness. So I knew everything there was to know at that time. So your life goes from here to here. And I'll also say that there's life before this information and there's life after. And boy, is that a very hard line of delineation.
Thank you. And I'll share that as a psychologist, the most common question I'm asked is, Dr. Al, is this normal? Is it normal that I'm scared, that I'm crying, that I'm not sleeping well at night, that it's hard for me to eat? And when rare disease patients and family members ask me, Dr. Al, that question, the answer is almost always yes. It's a perfectly normal response to a very unusual and acute set of conditions. Anybody would react in these ways. I myself, after Jack was diagnosed with SMA and given a year to live, had many of the same symptoms. I was scared. I'll never forget the sights and sounds of that room in the hospital when the doctor shared this news with us. It's kind of burned into my soul. And I was driving 40 miles an hour in the right lane on the highway thinking I would get in an accident. I was afraid to light the fireplace in the house we were living. I was afraid I'd burn the house down. If something this crazy and this bad could happen to our baby, then anything could happen. So your mind plays tricks on you. And the answer to that question, is this normal, when you're launched into the Twilight Zone, is almost always yes. As we find ourselves in the Twilight Zone, we're disoriented and we're by ourselves and we feel like nobody understands. And over a period of time, we adapt somehow. We reorient. I felt a sense of reorienting to that new world that Joanne just mentioned, that before and after diagnosis. I wonder if you all remember a point at which you knew that you were ready to move forward after the period of shock and disorientation. How did you know you were reorienting, that period in between shock and then making a plan, which we'll talk about after this? How did you know you were ready to move forward from that launch into the Twilight Zone?
So I'm an active duty Air Force officer, been in almost 22 years. And one of the tenets that we have in the Air Force, we often say, is that flexibility is the key to air power. The plans don't always go right when you want them to. And so I think the point where I finally grasped the flexibility with my son came about the first time we'd gone to a convention, the Galactosemia convention. And it was an opportunity for me to take a breath and just exhale, because I was around other people that had the same thing as him. And I saw the normal, that you're not on this island by yourself. When I think back to Stephen's diagnosis in 2012, I did not know that there was a NORD. Fast forward 40 years, this organization has been the trailblazers to bring light and life to rare diseases and disorders. And so I applaud that 40 years and wish 40 more years, if not more than that. But the thing that I've also learned about coming to that realization is that I had to deal with what I call the adversity. And adversity is like a sword. It cuts two ways. It cuts going in, because it will shatter who you think you are. But it also cuts coming out, because it will break open your authentic self. And it was that realization of the adversity that he has and the flexibility that I needed that gave me calm in the midst of chaos. And so that's when I started to do it. It was around that 1.5, 2 year mark when I started to say, this is not different. This is normal. This is my new normal. And that helped me.
And Al, I just want to share what I shared last night, which is for everybody in this room, I don't think we all realize how adaptable we are. I run, I'm a co-leader of the support group on Long Island, and a lot of us wear pumps. My brother wore a central line. I wear a pump that delivers my medication subcutaneously. It's a lot easier, but it's still a very big deal to shift your world and deal with your treatment. I remember a man in my support group really yelling at me and arguing, how am I going to do this? How am I going to sleep with this pump? What am I going to do? So I told him what I did. I buy pajamas with pockets. It goes right in my pocket. But I want everyone to remember, you are resilient, you are adaptable, you will survive, you will go on, you will adapt and move forward, because you have to. You have to.
The turning point for me was, I think, very much more internal. I want to share my sort of aha moment, if you will. I think that after Nell was diagnosed, I went into sort of a spiral of blaming myself, because I was her mother and her physician, and the whole time I was thinking I needed to find a way to fix this and go back to the point at which I had made that mistake. And this is where my sort of mental energy was being spent. It turned out that was really not very useful, because what I wasn't doing was really feeling into my pain, which was the loss of my robustly healthy daughter that I knew right before the diagnosis, and now sort of getting on board with like who she, what her life is going to look like now going forward. And so I think for me, the turning point came in the recognition that I could choose to feel my pain and accept it versus create the suffering, which is what I did. The way I created the suffering was with the self-blame, and that was because I didn't want to acknowledge this loss, and I didn't want our lives to change, and I was just trying to figure out how we could make our lives look the way it was before. That was my turning point, accepting my pain.
And my turning point, I think it was my son Jack himself who helped me turn the corner. I remember riding in the station wagon. He was in his little baby seat, and we had music playing. I remember the Baby Beluga, this baby song. And he was happy, and just happy to be in the car and happy to be going wherever we were going. And I remember this moment at which I moved from pure fear and grief, expecting we would lose him so soon, to saying to myself, well, he's happy, and our job is to give him the best life we can, no matter how long he's here with us, so that when he's gone, we can look back with no regrets. That was an important moment for me, and that was coupled with a moment that Colonel Stephen just alluded to, I attended my first conference of our Families of SMA, now called Cure SMA, meeting. And I got off the airplane and I went into the hotel. It was in Las Vegas. And it was kind of bizarre. I walked into the MGM hotel and I saw all these kids driving their wheelchairs around the slot machines. They were racing each other. And it was the first time I'd seen another child with the same condition my son had. And these kids were having a ball and they were racing around the casino and their mothers were chasing them saying, slow down. And they were saying, they were blowing off their mothers and racing. And they looked so happy. And those kids inspired me in making contact with other families and other kids who lived this life, gave me hope. So that first moment I thought, well, if Jack could live this long and be in a wheelchair, that would be a good thing. And those kids and their parents helped me in the beginning to reorient to a new world. And I want to comment on what Dr. Kang, what Maggie just said. We can choose. We have a choice to make when we're faced with these adverse situations. And what I've come to believe as a dad and as a psychologist is that hope can only arrive when we recognize that there are real options and that we have genuine choices. And hope can only flourish when you believe that your actions can bring about a future different from your present. That we're no longer at the mercy of forces outside of ourselves. That's when hope arrives. That's when hope can develop and hope can flourish. And I want to move now from that period of reorientation after the trauma of a diagnosis and that period of adaptation where we find that hope to how do we move forward? What's our game plan? We here, sitting up here, want to leave you with some tips and some tools and concrete actions you can take to be able to move forward with hope. And we all do that in different ways. And when we had our planning meeting and we talked about this conversation, Colonel Steve talked about his experience in the Air Force, and he talked about something called knee boards, which I hadn't heard before. Steve, I think it would be great if you could tell everybody what you told us about knee boards, because I'd like to use that as a way to launch our how do we move forward conversation.
So one of the things, if you've ever flown a plane, and I don't know how many of you have, but you ever ride in especially in fighter planes, it's a very small space. And so you don't have the luxury of the ability to reach over and look at an iPad, to look at long flight plans. And so what pilots do, now I don't fly, and if people ask me, I'll tell them I fly a 3C041, which happens to be my office desk. But if you do fly an F-15 or 35 or 22, you oftentimes will have what we call a knee board. So you'll see I actually have a white piece of paper here because I'm so used to having those things with me. But it is literally a flight plan that you strap to your knees because you're sitting the whole time. It's a knee board. But in that flight plan, it not only tells you where you're going, it tells you what to do in the event there's an emergency. And I think that's the great segue, as Al was talking about, is what's the plan? How do you have those tools in your tool bag to help you get from fear to this place of comfort, understanding, and resilience? How do you build those things? And so we offer those things in a knee board. One of the things that I would offer in a part of your tool bag would be learning to reframe. So the reframing of this is, how do we look at things through a different paradigm? How do I take the what if? Because Maggie often has said, what if I should have caught this earlier? I should have done this. But reframing that what if from the self, she has a wonderful TED Talk that I had a chance to look at. And it was a line that stuck out to me that said, suffering is inevitable. No, pain is inevitable, but suffering is a choice. Reframing, pain is inevitable. We're going to go through things. We're going to feel things. But whether we stay there is a choice. Reframing the situation from where you are. And I look at my son's experience and I say, if I had stayed in the place of what if he had not had the transplant? And I reframe that to say that because he had a transplant, I've learned new skills. I've learned about a new community. I've become a patient activist, not just an advocate, but an activist to really inform the world about rare diseases and disorders. Reframing is one of those tools that I think everyone would take that would really help you to go from really bad places, that pain, and make that choice to not suffer.
So I do want to comment that when Colonel Steve offered the idea of the knee board, my response was, we who are faced with rare disease are all on a dangerous mission. And I thought about all the times I took my son out with his wheelchair and his ventilator and all his medical equipment, and making sure there was air in the tires of the handicap van and the ventilator was charged up. Everything felt a little bit dangerous every time we went out. So having a flight plan, a knee board, to make sure that we can be safe as we're moving forward, and to focus on what's our plan to move forward. Maggie, Joanne, it would be good if we could talk about what's in your flight plans.
Sure. I'd like to sort of piggyback off what the Colonel was talking about in terms of the idea of reframing, which is, I guess, what I'm calling in my mind, creating your new narrative. I think previously when I talked to you about when Nell was first diagnosed, I kind of chose to go to thoughts of self-blame, and it ended up creating a lot of anxiety and resentment in me, which persisted for about 2 years, and I wasn't really doing well from a mental perspective, and therefore I wasn't actually being as good a caregiver as I wanted to Nell. So when I came into that realization that I had the choice to sort of reframe or recreate a narrative, I chose to do that after I accepted my pain. When I moved through it, I actually came out on the other side being able to see sort of like these moments of possibility, these micro moments as I described in the talk. And it helped me to sort of shift my energies into sort of hope, as you said, and seeing that Nell was actually getting better and that I was a part of this process. And so that became my new narrative, to become a caregiver mom, to know that there's so much hope. And that's, I think, how I was moved to give my talk. Nell was moved to write her book, My Hospital Story. And then we ended up sort of connecting with Rare Disease Foundations for NMO, and here we are today. So I think this here has become our new narrative, one of hope and resilience and community.
And finally, one of the tools in our toolbox that we talk a lot about in our support group is staying as informed and knowledgeable as possible, because that takes away the uncertainty. When you're up on what's out there, what's available, existing within your community, pulling support from that community, that kind of helps with the uncertainty. So stay informed as you can, stay up on everything, and then you kind of blow the doors off the doctor when they see how educated you are. I like that.
I think it's important for all of us as an antidote to uncertainty to appreciate each and every day when we have stability, when we have a routine, when we have a plan that we can follow and it works predictably, to connect with others in our rare disease communities who offer us hope, who are ahead of us in their journey and can provide some mentoring and some support to us when we're living such an unusual life. Being able to stay in the present is something we all are challenged to do in this very busy world we live in of social media and internet. It's really important for us all to stay in the present and not think too far into the future. If I thought too far into the future after they told us our son would live a year, I never would have gotten out of the bed. I had to stay with each and every day. Moving forward, we'll finish up with, as we move forward in our lives, how do we move forward and get to what I would call the more advanced level of managing uncertainty, appreciating every day and living with a sense of grace and dignity? That's what I see when I see families like yours. I see grace and I see dignity. Let's comment for just a second, then we'll take some Q&A on how do you view your life now, all these years later? How do we view our lives now? Very briefly, how do we view our lives these years later with grace and dignity?
I'm going to push to Steve.
So, I think that the idea of moving from fear to hope to love is, I codify it in service. Right? Dr. Martin Luther King once said that service is the price we pay for the space we occupy. And I was captivated this morning by some words that came from the Archbishop of Canterbury because, King Charles III had his coronation today. And for some reason, I happened to get up. But one of the words or phrases that he had mentioned resonated with me as I think about this. And he said that service is love in action. So when I juxtapose what Dr. King said and what the Archbishop said, service. And so when you think about how do you live in the moment, I say, one, you have to be mindful. Mindfulness is so important to understand the place that you are now, not wish for something else, but embrace where you are now, the mindfulness. Understanding that mental health is actually health and that we don't sacrifice our mental health because there is an emotional part of me that had to grow and develop as my son was growing and develop. And the thing, my son is making this flashing sign to me so I will mention this. We wrote a children's book and we wrote a children's book, but in writing this children's book, that was a part of my therapy. That was a part of me being able to share his story, to normalize what he has gone through, for me to put out emotions, for him to put out emotions about his experience. That was a part of being mindful. That was a part of us understanding the importance of mental health. And the fact that we're here to be able to talk about these things is a part of service. It's that price we pay for that space that that we collectively occupy.
Thank you, Colonel. And I'll finish with a thought that it took me about 25 years to experience, and that is that along with a rare disease, our kids and our family members also bring some unanticipated rare gifts. It occurred to me, and my son is no longer here, but he's still here helping. I feel called to serve as we all do, sitting up here to help other families because of my experience. And what I learned from Jack and others like him is that they come with some unanticipated rare gifts. Every time my son drove his wheelchair into a room, without saying a word, everybody else's big problems got smaller really fast. He offered the gift of perspective. Jack was a magnet. Our kids are magnets for open-hearted, compassionate people. I've met such wonderful people that I wouldn't have met, but Jack had a way of drawing in people who are open and compassionate. And I think we find that our rare disease bring about the gift of bringing out the best in other people. My son had the gift of bringing out the best in everybody whose path he crossed. So for me personally, and what helps fuel me also as a professional who supports families like ours, is this experience of a very unusual, rare experience of rare gifts along with the rare challenges. I'll leave you with that thought, and I thank you all for taking the time to listen to us reflect, and we hope we're leaving you with something of value. And we wish you a wonderful conference experience. And Tiffany is here letting us know it's question and answer time, and I believe there are some questions that have come in.
Yes, we already have a couple of questions in. The first is, as a caregiver, I often find myself worrying about the future of my child. How do I explain our world of unknowns to my child, who is also living in a world of uncertainty, in a way that will help put their mind at ease?
So, okay. Well, parents. So, the thing that I would say is you do it early and you do it often. My son cannot have anything that has dairy, any galactose. And so at a very early age, we were always reinforced, don't eat that. Don't just take things from people. I asked him this morning as we were driving in, I said, you're going to go to the childcare thing. So what's the first thing you do if someone offers you food? He said, first I have to read the label. I've got to make sure that I know, and then go ask an adult. So you do it early and you do it often. And the other thing that I would offer is to normalize. There's a story I heard about a person that was in a wheelchair, and someone went up to them and said, well, I'm so sorry you're in this wheelchair. You can't do this, you can't do that. And that person said, wait a minute, the wheelchair gives me life. The wheelchair gives me the ability to go places. I'm not bedridden. I can go outside. I can't run, but I can go outside. I can play basketball, do all those things. And so it's start early and do it often and help them to understand that this is normal. We all have a normal, and this is your normal, and most importantly, that's okay.
And we found in our support group that the children adapted easier and faster than the adults.
And I'll share that in the support groups I facilitate for our children with SMA, they always ask, Dr. Al, how can we get our parents to stop worrying about us so much? There's much more to say about this question. It's a wonderful question, but we should probably take another one or two at if time's available.
Many of us have had a long diagnostic journey full of medical gaslighting due to the perception of being an overbearing parent. After years of being dismissed or brushed off, it's hard to trust the medical community. Did any of you experience this? And if so, how did you rebuild your trust?
So, okay. So I'll tell you, the one thing that I had a lot of distrust with the medical community at first because I felt that there was a delay and a missed diagnosis for my son. And so being that parent who was very actively involved was a bit of a shock to the system for medicine. We didn't have this whole patient and family advisory councils that are now somewhat pervasive through all of medicine, and certainly CMS has said you need to have them for insurance purposes. But the thing that I often remind providers of, and everyone in the room can attest to this, that going to the hospital is a significant emotional event. When I worked in the Pentagon, I never looked at the stuff that was on the walls. I didn't really care that we have a Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts beside each other trying to compete for who's going to sell the best pumpkin spice latte. Did not care. But the providers, they oftentimes, if I were taking someone on a tour, they would be amazed at those things. Providers forget that in the hospital, that it's cold, it's sterile, that this is foreign to us, that there's a different language that's spoken in the hospital. And so being active and advocating for yourself, advocating for your child, for patients, for others, is again a part of that service. And so if you're talking about how do you deal with it as a parent, be that voice, be that squeaky wheel, because you're going to inspire change in this culture of medicine.
Also, anyone with a rare illness knows that the ER is one of the most terrifying places you can go. I have a 3-page document of my meds, my doctors, everything about me, my illness, my bump, because what if I can't speak for myself? And the other thing is that when I see something, what are you giving me? What's in that bag? How will that impact me? Sometimes you know more than the doctors, and that's terrifying. But I always ask the question, and also I have mailed letters to doctors after an urgent problem because I want to educate them. This is a rare illness. My doctor told me in medical school there was one paragraph about pulmonary hypertension, one paragraph. So don't be afraid to educate.
I kind of feel like I have to respond or make a comment being a physician and a caregiver. I will say, though, probably because I'm a physician, I haven't been gaslighted per se. However, I've heard so many personal accounts of people who have, and it really, really frustrates me. And though I don't have anything like very specific to say, I will offer this, that if you have a diagnosis like NMO, let's say, and you show up to an ER, maybe bring information with you, because a lot of those ER physicians have never heard of this disease. They don't understand the urgency of what is necessary. I mean, people have gone blind and have become permanently paralyzed because of delayed action. So I would say, I mean, just to echo a couple things here, is that I think arming yourself with information and showing it to them and bringing things up like on your phone to say, this is an article that has been written about this management specifically. We have always seen a neurologist. Can you contact my person here? And even though you're out of town, try to get a doctor of that same specialist. For us, it's neurology. Could you order a neuroconsult, please? I think if you say very specific things and tell them the urgency of it, I'm hoping that they're going to listen to you. And that's, I think, the best I can offer. So sorry about that.
We have two tiny
couple of.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
We're running out of time, Al. We have a tiny question. Are therapy services typically covered by insurance? And Colonel Coffee, what is the title of the book?
So I will give an answer about therapy services and the book. So therapy services probably depend on the type of insurance you have. I do know that there are oftentimes state-funded OT, PT that is often covered. So there are those services available, but it probably goes back to the type of insurance that you have. And so certainly check with your providers for that, and check with the state to see if there are supplemental services that you can get. The title of the book is Baby Stephen's Gift of Life. So definitely it's out there, Barnes and Nobles and a couple other places, but thank you so much for that question.
Let's wrap up with a final thought about the previous question. I'll never forget when my baby was diagnosed and the doctor said, don't worry, Dr. Freedman, you're going to become the expert on SMA and you're going to teach us all about it. And I thought to myself, I don't want to be an expert on SMA. I don't want to have anything to do with this. I was scared. I wanted to have somebody know more than I knew about it. And so from that moment, I searched for the doctors who knew more than I knew. And over the years, we partnered with the doctors in the hospital. And I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that doctors are people too. Here's one right here. And they have challenging jobs. We have to know about one condition. They have to know about all of them. And this is a moment, I think, to remind ourselves that the reason this is called rare is because it is rare. To those of us in this room, this is our norm. It's not rare to us, but our family members' conditions are rare to everybody else in the world but us. And that's why we're in such a unique position. And I want to wrap up by thanking all three of you for joining me up here. It's been a privilege to get to know you and to offer the panel to the group, and to thank all of you for your time and attention. And we're here today if we can be of support to you or your families while we're here for the remainder of the conference. Thank you all so very much, and our love to your families and to all of you.